Adverse Childhood Experiences in Today's Environment. Presented by Laura Alderman.
Laura serves as the director of the Institute for Childhood Resilience within the LSU Health Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine. The mission of that institute is to create a safe and nurturing community for children and families by bringing the science of resilience to policy and practice. She's the founder and CEO of Educational Resources for Families, Inc., which provides evidence-based mental health services for children and adults. She's also an organizational consultant supporting early childhood education, evidence-based mental health treatments, student mental health, community resilience, and results-based facilitation. She recently served as the executive director of Step Forward, a cradle-to-career collective impact initiative working to ensure success for every child in Northwest Louisiana. Step Forward consists of more than 500 organizations and thousands of individuals aligning resources to move critical indicators in a positive direction for children and young adults. And it's been the host platform for many action-oriented community convenings, including the Early Childhood Policy Summit, the Teen Summit on Mental Wellness, and the impact of social justice on children. Laura has lengthy experience in the juvenile justice system, having served as the mental health coordinator for Caddo Parish Juvenile Court and began the first juvenile mental health court in Louisiana. In this role, she served as the principal investigator for the John T. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Models for Change grant in Caddo Parish. The Caddo Parish Juvenile Mental Health Court was one of only 2 nationwide sites to be studied by the National Institute for Justice to determine the effectiveness of juvenile mental health courts. She's a former early childhood educator and is a fellow of the Tulane University Early Childhood Policy Leadership Institute. She serves as a trainer there for juvenile justice and mental health curriculum, adverse childhood experiences presentations, and research-based facilitation. She is also the co-author for a child care training curriculum for the Louisiana Department of Education on early brain development. So very well ready to talk to us today. So thank you so much. The stage is yours.
Thanks, Ashley. I've got to condense that bio is way too long. Juliana and Paulette, thank you for that great presentation and for the work you're doing. And it's so nice to see you both. So it is my pleasure to be able to share this really important information with you. And probably many of you are familiar with this classic study that we're going to talk about, but in the event that you're not, I hope that this will be beneficial information. And for those of you who are familiar, hopefully you'll learn something new. But I do want to thank and acknowledge the Louisiana Department of Health Bureau of Family Health, which is the platform for all ACE education that is happening in Louisiana, utilizing this presentation slide deck that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So this was developed by Dr. Robert Anda, one of the principal investigators of the ACE study. And let's proceed on and talk about the work that he did. So his partner was Dr. Vincent Belidi, and between 1995 and 1997, they studied over 17,000 participants who were Kaiser Permanente insurance recipients or members in the state of California. And they found, actually, we're going to give you a little bit of background, and then I'm going to share with you what the findings were of that study. Okay, so just to have a little biology lesson before we talk about the study, it's important to understand our human nervous system. And our central nervous system really is the part of our anatomy that is making sense of our environment at all times and assessing things like temperature and whether we're hungry and whether we're tired, and also whether we are in danger or not. And so you see these nerve cells, these neurons or neural connections, and these three columns illustrate the density at different ages of our synapses. So at birth, you see there's it's pretty sparse, and that's a great illustration of the fact that our brains are not fully developed at birth, far from it. There's a great deal of brain development that's still happening, especially in the first 5 years of life. By elementary ages, you see the density of neural connections that exist there. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child estimates that we form 1 billion neural connections every second in the first 3 years of life. 1 billion with a B. That's hard to wrap your consciousness around. But so in puberty, we see that density has decreased somewhat through a process called pruning. So we're learning lots of information in our early years, and that information that we don't continue to use is pruned away. So in childhood, we have a variety of conditions that we're going to experience as children. Whoops, let me go back to this previous slide. Some children are existing in more dangerous situations and others in more safe environments. And what happens is that we adapt to those environments. For children who are in frequent adversity or experiencing harsh conditions, they're often in that fight, flight, or freeze activated, where that part of their brain, the amygdala, is activated and ready to protect them. This is part of our nervous system, which I referenced earlier. And then for children who are in more protected environments, their adaptation is that they are able to form relationships with people, see possibilities. They have the luxury of time to process information. They can often survive the best conditions, but may be more vulnerable in the worst, as compared to those children who are experiencing more adversity. So thinking about that and the experiences that we have in childhood, what kind of situations do you think might be a good match for a person who tends to be in that fight or flight state a lot, edgy and hypervigilant or emotionally detached? And the photo on the screen gives you an enormous clue. First responders need those characteristics in order to do the jobs that they're required to do. So adaptations versus expectations. When our adaptation to our environment doesn't match with the expectations of others that we encounter, then we have problems. And the most obvious example of that is in a classroom. So for a child who has experienced a lot of adverse conditions, it may be hard for them to concentrate, hard for them to sit still. They may respond to certain cues in unusual and unpredictable ways. If those cues happen to trigger a memory of a traumatic experience. One example of that is a young lady that I worked with in the juvenile justice system, and for her, flipping on a light switch was a reminder of molestation, and that was the signal that something bad was about to happen. And so when someone would flip a light switch on in a classroom, she would have a trauma response, and oftentimes violent behavior would occur. And so and I want to just pause here and say that's a great example of when a child's behaviors are disproportionate, or their reaction is disproportionate to what's going on in the present moment, then we should ask ourselves, what is the story that I don't know about this child? What has happened to this child that might have resulted in this extreme response? So there are sensitive periods for children, and I've already mentioned early childhood being one of those. There are also differences for genders in terms of the type of trauma that takes place and has the most severe impact at different times. So for boys in early childhood, maternal rejection or neglect has a particularly damaging effect on cross-brain communication. And that same type of impairment can be a greater risk for girls at later ages when they are victims of sexual abuse. And so different types of traumatic events can have a different impact based on age and gender. So executive skills are the things that we need for complex thinking and goal-focused action. We use our prefrontal cortex to activate executive skills, and it doesn't work well when our amygdala is being activated by cues from our body, our central nervous system, that we are in danger. And so sometimes, as I've alluded to earlier, children can misunderstand those cues and perceive that they are in fact in danger when they're not. And these very important attributes that you see on the screen right now become impaired or just impossible to activate. Emotional control, flexible thinking, sustained attention, time management, organization, all of these are things that we need in great supply to succeed academically and in life. So what do we do when we know that children have experienced significant trauma or adversity? And let me just pause here and say, I think we must all acknowledge that the net of adversity has now widened. I'm going to share with you the types of adversity that the ACE study considered, and I'm pretty convinced that there should be an 11th ACE added to that list, and that's pandemic. So Doctors Felitti and Anda wanted to understand health-harming behaviors and why individuals continue to engage in these health-harming behaviors despite the wise advice of their physicians to stop doing things like smoking, abusing drugs, overeating, etc. And in the process of this study, they began to ask questions. In particular, Dr. Felitti did this, began to ask questions about a person's childhood and the things that they had experienced. And he began to see a trend that there was significant childhood adversity that seemed to be related to these health-harming behaviors that people would engage in. And so the ACE study looked at 10 different types of adversity. This is not all inclusive. As I've mentioned, we could include pandemic on this list, but things that might be missing from this list that you might think of would be the death of a loved one, or serious injury, or a natural disaster. But for purposes of this study, they looked at 5 types of household dysfunction: substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, violence to mother, incarcerated family member. Under the category of neglect, you see emotional and physical neglect, and under the category of abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. And I do want to pause here and say that 25 to 40% of us on this call today probably have high numbers of ACEs in our history, and this does not mean that our outlook is doomed. That is really, really important for us to acknowledge and continue to stress. But what the ACE study found was this: ACEs are common and they are corrosive. I want you to look at the last two groups on the right and just mentally combine those, if you will. Individuals with 3 or more ACEs, there was 26% total of that group in the study. So adding those two groups, 3 and 4 or more, we get 26%. And the reason I'm asking you to do that is that in Northwest Louisiana, a couple of years ago, we used the ACE questionnaire with a very unscientific method, but I think this is worth commenting on. We showed the documentary Resilience to an audience of about 250 individuals at a local independent film theater called the Robinson Film Center. Arguably, these were individuals who were not struggling economically because they had transportation to get to the film center. They knew about it, and they were motivated to come see this documentary. We did not ask them for their economic status, but for the sake of argument, we're going to presume that this group was probably not economically disadvantaged. And of that 220, 42% of them had 3 or more ACEs in their history, as compared to the ACE study, which was done on a population in California that was predominantly white, middle class, and most of the study participants had at least some college. That is not a match for our demographics here in Louisiana, and certainly not Northwest Louisiana. So we have some indicators that the prevalence of ACEs in our state and in our community in particular are much higher than were shown in this study. So what the researchers learned was this. This slide is a perfect illustration of this dose-response relationship. As the number of ACEs or adverse experiences increased in a person's history, if there were 5 or more ACEs, then 55% of that group were at greater risk for multiple chronic health problems, more than 40 chronic health problems, including things like diabetes, heart disease, and lung cancer, and 6 of the 10 leading causes of death. I want to let that sink in. 6 of the 10 leading causes of death are correlated to ACEs in childhood. Now, this chart is slightly misleading, and it is developed by the CDC. This is a CDC chart. If you notice, the vertical axis only goes up to 60. And so I want you to pay attention to that, because I mentioned 55% of those with 5 or more ACEs had this increased risk. But the good news, 45% did not have an increased risk despite having high numbers of ACEs. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that phenomenon in just a few seconds. So just to give you a few specific health condition examples, let's look. You'll see this stepwise progression, this correlation of increased ACEs correlating with increased risk for smoking initiation, current smoking, COPD. You also see this with alcoholism and marrying an alcoholic. And my personal theory about why the risk is greater for someone to be married to an alcoholic as opposed to being an alcoholic themselves is that I would propose or hypothesize that those with that increased risk may have had that ACE in their households growing up. Substance abuse, if you recall, is one of the household adverse childhood experiences. And so we're drawn to what's familiar, right? So it's quite possible that individuals who are raised in that type of household with substance abuse present would be likely to have a partner who also has a substance abuse problem. ACEs not surprisingly, are also linked to depression, and this risk appears to be higher for women than men. And I say appears because it is quite possible that men are less likely to report depression, but you do still see that increased risk as the number of ACEs goes up. So here's a partial list of ACE attributable problems, and they include some of the ones that I mentioned, also unintended pregnancy, obesity, liver disease, coronary heart disease, drug abuse and illicit drug use, and the list goes on. As I mentioned, there are more than 40. So we know ACEs are common, they're interrelated, and they're powerful. I do want to mention that the ACE study is considered a landmark study, and it's considered to be, it's been called as transformational to the field of medicine as germ theory. That's pretty significant. That's a very significant impact. So it's changed the paradigm of how we view chronic health problems. We know that there are very high ACE scores, particularly in some pockets of our country, most likely in our own state, that increases our risk for multiple health and social problems. And there's also an intergenerational transmission of ACEs. And so the field of epigenetics indicates to us that what happened to our ancestors affects our own biology. And so changes in the genetic expression can take place when an individual experiences toxic stress, and those changes are then passed on to subsequent generations. So this is another illustration of the population attributable risk. And these are just some of the many conditions that are related to ACEs, but you can see that oil spill in the middle indicates a percentage of each one of those life problems that is related to adversity in childhood. And so imagine the impact if we could dry up that oil spill and prevent or mitigate the impact of ACEs. So what do we do about this this sobering information? What do we do with these findings? Well, we remember that 45% of that initial study population did not have an increased risk, and what they did have was resilience. And we know a lot about resilience at this point. There's been a couple of decades of research on the essential components of resilience. And so some of our core protective systems include capabilities, attachment and belonging, and then community, culture, and spirituality. So this is similar to a model that I use a lot in presentations on the science of resilience. And we talk about the building blocks for resilience. And the most important building block is safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. We need those at all ages, but in particular, children need those. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. So if there are trusted adults in a child's life, then they are more likely to be able to bounce back from adversity. Because the truth is, most of us are going to experience adversity in our lives, whether that's as a child or as an adult. And the feeling of being supported by others is healing, it's therapeutic, it helps us to not feel alone. And this is most important for children. So let me talk about individual capabilities a little bit. What do we mean by that? Capabilities can refer to a couple of different things. Capabilities are the things that you're good at, the things that you enjoy doing. When I am working with a counseling client and I ask them the question, what do you like to do for fun? I'm not just making small talk. I am assessing resilience, because fun is as essential to our well-being as food is to our bodies. It gives us a glimpse of a life worth living. It gives our brain a break from thinking about difficult and stressful things. And we all need to be sure that we are incorporating enjoyable activities in our lives. Capabilities also include skills that we develop through those enjoyable things, like skills at sports or music or art or academics. Capabilities can also include the ability to cope with negative emotions. So we all need to be able to express negative emotions when we feel them. And children are no different. So if a child experiences maltreatment, they're going to have righteous anger, and they need to have help to know what to do with that anger. And suppressing the anger is not the answer. So they've got to have a healthy and safe means of expressing that. And then again, I'll just repeat what I shared already, and that is that relationships are vital. We can't build resilience without those positive relationships in our lives. They are essential. And the good news is none of us are born with resilience, but we can build it at any time and at any age. And the cost to building resilience is minimal to none. And the cost to not having resilience is enormous. And we see that every day in incarceration rates, in rising substance abuse disorders, in the increase in psychiatric emergencies, and the list goes on. And so I do just want to make a personal appeal and say that it is vitally important that we as a state are spending resources on prevention and treatment at the early end of the experience of childhood adversity, so that once we are aware that a child has experienced hardship in extreme amounts, that we give them opportunities to recover and to receive the treatment that they need, so they're not escalating to these deep end systems that have these harsh and terrible outcomes. And then community, faith, and culture. It's important to know that community can fill in the gaps when children don't have trusted adults within their household, within their immediate family. And that is often the case, certainly for children that I would work with in the juvenile justice system. You would ask them, if you asked them who they trusted and who would support them, oftentimes it would be difficult for them to think of someone. Similarly, if I asked them, what are you good at? 100% of the time, they could never tell me. And that became an important goal for us as we were working with each child, is to help them discover what they are capable of, what their gifts are. That's an important opportunity for resilience. So in Northwest Louisiana, we're going to be doing some work to build resilience in some vulnerable populations and some geographically specific areas where we know families are fragile and where we know the risks are great for adversity for children and adults. And in these communities, poverty is rampant. So we can't expect people to find transportation to get to a resilience building opportunity. We have to bring it to them. So planning is in place to create these resilient centers, if you will. And we're excited to see that work come to fruition. So I've kind of flown through this presentation to try to get us to a stopping point on time, but I want to pause here and ask if anyone has any comments or questions that they want to mention. I want to take a moment for that.
Laura, this is Ashley. So I know you had mentioned, obviously, the original ACE study had those 10 elements that it looked at, but we recognize that there are a lot of other things that really can be seen as traumatic experiences in Louisiana, obviously, with hurricanes and floods and those kinds of things that we've experienced over the last few years, and displacement, and now adding COVID and all of the different changes that children and families are really having to go through. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some ideas that to address some of those different kinds of ACEs that families are experiencing, or things that you've seen that maybe we can all put in our toolbox?
Sure.
Easily?
Yeah. I would say this: adversity, no matter what the event is, it's going to have a similar impact on our bodies and our biology. Toxic stress becomes corrosive to us physically and emotionally. And so some of the strategies that are low or no cost are so easy to implement, and that a lot of them do depend on a person's preferences or interests. But when we're thinking about shallow end resilience building or therapeutic activities, we're wanting people to be involved in music opportunities. If they're interested in, learning to play an instrument or singing or being a part of some kind of performance art experience, then, that's certainly a wonderful resilience building opportunity. Meditation, mindfulness, and yoga have enormous research behind them as being healing to the traumatized brain. I would encourage anybody who wants to learn more about that to pick up the book by Dr. James Gordon called The Transformation. He is the director of the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, and some of you on this call today may actually be involved in some training he's going to be doing in Baton Rouge soon. But those are just a couple of examples. Being outside, being in nature is really, really important. We're seeing a growing number of physicians who are actually prescribing something called forest bathing. Being outdoors just immediately elevates the mood, as opposed to being confined inside. And we've all had more than enough confinement over the last year and a half, but there's nothing stopping us from walking outside and being surrounded by nature. So those are just a few examples. Another thing we encourage people to do is focus on what they are grateful for, not to ignore adversity that has been in their history, but to acknowledge that there are some positive attributes and characteristics and experiences to their life. Just that shift in perspective can be enormously therapeutic. And then finally, I want to just challenge you all to do some reading on positive childhood experiences, or PCEs, and child flourishing. There's been a lot of work done by Dr. Christina Bethel in these areas, and there's great information. The PACES Connection website is something that you all may want to become familiar with. And PACES stands for Positive and Adverse Childhood Experiences. There's a a plethora of resources available on that website, so please take full advantage of it.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Scan the QR code or go directly to the link to complete the evaluation and claim education credit after viewing all the presentations. Please reach out if you have any additional questions or if you need any assistance.